Okay, folks. Uh, Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this asynchronous presentation. We're going to move now. I did the welcome and ended with the quote, and now we proceed. It's probably just as lunatic to take the few hundred years that we're going to look at and try to condense them into a cogent 10-week, 10 meeting course so that you understand everything. But because there are historians that study almost every year of this. But in any event, we proceed. In order to understand the Industrial Revolution, we kind of have to understand how we get to it. What are the conditions of the governments, the people, the thought process that says, okay, we can change things. And then we'll have to show what was there and then what changed. And to do that, what I'm going to do is start with just a long view to give you the idea. And that is this. The Industrial Revolution was primary in changing four things: labor, power. I should have written them down. I'm writing them now so I remember. Um, Machines and capital. We'll take them on not quite in that order. The first one I'm going to take on is power. Look, ancient man, particularly ancient man, had one source of power. And I'm not talking about political power. I'm talking about physical power, how to get around. And that was human muscle. And it wasn't until centuries later that we domesticated animals, and for that matter, plants. So we were stronger because we were healthier. But in domesticating animals, one of the biggies, of course, was the horse. Others were the ox, cows, sheep. And these provided us not only food, but in particular, mobility. We could now move around with animal muscle, animal power. From there, we discovered water power. And the first textile mills were set up all on rivers. Why? You put a water wheel up, the river goes by, and it turns big cranks inside, which turns the machines inside the factory. But that also developed the factory system. Jump ahead, steam. Ahead further, electricity. Ahead further, and you have, what do you call it? Gas and petroleum, the oil power. And then you have nuclear power today. So, and we're translating some of those other more natural things, solar and wind, to do some of the things. Wind power operates indirectly because we pump it to electricity, but almost like the water power. We use the wind to indirectly crank out our machineries. All right, the second thing that changed over a long period of time, but particularly in the Industrial Revolution, was labor. The most labor was survival based through history. Hunter-gathering society wanted to get food, had to gather it, which made society very mobile. Because shoot, when you start hunting animals, do they hang out? No. In addition, animals aren't stupid. They need food. And so they would move to new food sources as they depleted one. And so if you're a hunter-gatherer, what does that mean? You move. You move with the animals, you move with the seasons. So we were nomadic, small groups of people. Well, that developed. And as we started moving away and developed cities, which coincides with the domesticating of plants, where we can now grow things, and domesticating of animals, where we could now have that food source available to us without traveling and being nomads, we built cities. And as we built cities, we had needs of other folks to do things for us. Like for a while, out on the prairie, for example, if I was taking America, you made your furniture, you made your pots and pans, you did it, you made your leather goods, your saddles, you did it. In the feudal system, you had artisans who could do it for the rich, the barons, the earls, the people with the mansions that owned the land. And then some of those people were their army and enforcement unit. Some of those people grew their food, and some of those people were the artisans that made the tinkers that made the pans and pots, blacksmiths who did the metal work, the tanners who did the leather work, etc. Potters that made the pots, the plates and dishes. These people worked for the manor, made the replacement items, and they had to eat too. Now, in some cases, there was overlap with what they grew, but in some cases, they got food because the manor gave it to them by taking it from the serfs or the peasants who were growing the food. But as that cities grew, those folks moved out and realized cities needed the same things. So you could open a shop. Some entrepreneurs then figured out, wait a minute, if I have all these people that are really good at making shoes, shoes, if I pay them to make shoes, and I have one here and one down the block and one over here and one over here and one over here, and I pay them and collect at the end of the week, month, whatever, and give them their money, I now have a shoe store. I'm a merchant. And that's called, the people who worked in it were a cottage industry. And that was the first development of industry of any kind. And it kind of went along hand in hand with the primary economic theories of the day. And that was, and I want you to get this down, mercantilism. Now, mercantilism has 4 principles. I'm stuck. Wow. Mercantilism has 4 principles. And in mercantilism, the first principle is 1, understand finite world. And since it's finite, there's a finite amount of wealth in that world. Now, you don't have to agree on any particular source. We could disagree on that. But whatever it was, since the world is finite, there's a finite amount, fixed amount. And since there was an agreement at the Treaty of Westfall way back that we would respect borders once established, you only had the wealth that was within your borders. Now, everybody wants their people to thrive. And of course, the governments want to thrive and survive, and they want to collect taxes, and the king wanted to be richer. Put that all together, and you have the second phase. Because you already have what's in your borders, you want to get more, you have to get it from elsewhere. And that's the second principle, is to get more wealth, you have to take it from others. And the problem with that is you can't get it voluntarily most of the time. Hi, give me your gold. Huh? Come on. That just doesn't work. So here's the deal. To get it from others, you had a bunch of economic tools, and this is the heart of mercantilism. Things like tariffs. Tariffs made your goods more favorable, less expensive elsewhere. Other things like government subsidies for your home industries. That is, a tax break. Your business doesn't pay taxes, but anybody bringing in or foreigners doing a factory gets taxed. You get tax breaks, you get other incentives, access to raw materials that would cost you more because the government controlled it all. Mercantilism was absolute government control of the economy. And because you had to take from others and use these tools, economics was viewed as a war, as a method of war. People aren't going to give it to you voluntarily, so you had to do something to them to make them give up. And that was a war. And of course, only governments can wage war. So governments were in absolute control of the economy. And the fourth principle was when all else fails, when the tariffs fails and the government supports fails and any other economic supports fail, your only alternative then, and it's a legitimate alternative, is actual war. Go send your troops and go take it. Take territory. Take territory with the resources that you don't have. And that led to numerous European wars. And of course, when you say government control of all one part of the world, if you will, the economy, and I'll elucidate on that in a second, you automatically have monarchy, dictatorships, absolute monarchy. Conditions. The breakthrough to these conditions were the growth of the cottage industries. Now, there's three realms in society to keep you up: the political, the social, and the economic. If you can name something that isn't one of those three, I'm listening. But I bet you it is. So whenever you concentrate all power in one of those, you have to control the rest to keep that power, to maintain it, to make it work. You can't have total economic power without having buy-in from the people. You can't have political power without having buy-in from the people. You can't have total economic power without controlling the political. You can't have dissent. You can't say, oh, we think you should do it a different way, because that would weaken the control or change it. And then the government would lose control, and they can't do that and still take from others, which is the number two. Okay. So mercantilism was the way of the world. And the form of government, monarchy, was the way of the world. All governments, and I think I mentioned this in the introduction, were monarchs until World War I. So the time we're talking about here, all the predominant governments are monarchs, exception developing, at the time we're starting here, is the United States. Now, during the Enlightenment, and that's where we're going, thinking began to change. Thinking began to change in such a way that, gee whiz, does a monarch really rule by divine right? Should we have a monarch in some cases? And I think I want to give you some of the thinkers, uh, whoops, in this. Uh, I just lost it. Where's Hume? There he is. Yeah. Uh, Hume said there's no demonstrable reasoning that proves anything but a moral position. Just be good to others. In other words, do you need religion to tell you that? He said no. And remember, religion was a driving force of the power. I told you about, I don't remember if I did or not, so we'll do it now. Montesquieu came out with this scientific study of man would yield the best type of government. Scientific study of man, sociology, biology, genetics, yeah, right. Psychology. That's what he was talking about. He also, there was one called, and few people know this one, Lietu, Lieteau, says science is new. We need to obliterate the feudal system and the aristocracy. War, however, is irrational. Just follow the law until they change. In other words, he's arguing for change within existing systems, even if the laws are made by idiots. Follow them. Rousseau changed our thinking. He argued against Adam Smith that man was not, and John Locke, that man was not greedy, that natural man is happiest and not nasty and greedy, as most philosophers of the day posited. They needed freedom from societal restraints. Highly structured aristocracy and a feudal system that dictated where you lived, what you did, where you ate, whether you ate, was antithetical to human nature. He also argued that majority rule equals tyranny. Hence, you see in the United States, we really don't have majority rule. Your 10 amendments is 10 things government can't do, no matter how many people want it done. A system that does not serve its people, Rousseau said, should be destroyed and given to the people to do something else. And government power can't be centralized or should not be centralized. It must be split. The political and social and economic must be split. So along comes some others. Thomas Hobbes, he was still arguing life would be nasty, brutish, and short without a solitary, nasty, brutish, and short without a king. That is the best, if you will, system because man is greedy and needs to be controlled. You go, oh, well, geez, that sounds bad. But he also said the king's power doesn't come from God, it comes from the people. It's a social contract. And then John Locke comes along and expands that idea. He says, yeah, it's a social contract. He says, but more than that, the king can abuse his power and breach the contract. And when he does, he forfeits the right, the social right, the legitimate right to govern. And when he forfeits that right, the people have a right to institute whatever government, form of government, or legislature that they determine. Now, this thinking started trickling down, and Voltaire, who was in France at Louis the 14th's time, and Louis was definitely a absolutist monarch. He jailed Voltaire twice for satirical criticism of the government, and then later banished him, so he went to England. Well, banishment's better than the alternative. But anyway, goes to England, where he got this feeling, as not really correctly, but this is what he observed. It was much more freedom. There was no enforced state religion. There was a state religion. It just wasn't enforced. You could believe other things. There wasn't any aristocratic privilege. There was aristocrats, but their privilege was somewhat limited. We in the 1200s, 1215, I think it was, the Magna Carta. King Richard had to sign it when the barons revolted and protected themselves from absolute king power. Few traditions, no censorship, and no inefficient bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in England worked well, and he thought that was pretty good. So, through the 18th and 19th century, secular government noted that whenever religious leaders were given power, it led to intolerance. Religion and power, when they go together, are a fantastically powerful motivating force. But what really was happening is from about 1720 to 1820, in that 100-year period, people were developing through the coffee houses, the education systems, the government, and even into educated homes where tutors were teaching. We were becoming a suspicion of a priori reasoning, therefore, but, and tradition, and authority. There became natural and rational explanation, and they were sought, as opposed to spiritual explanations. Remember, Galileo came to a scientific explanation of the position of the Earth in the solar system. And he was threatened with heresy by the church, so much so that he decided he better recant or die. And being a smart man, he, said, I was wrong. But we know he was right. Scientific method became more popular. As the Letou was saying, science is new. And it was Barclay, who was writing and had said, hey, the human knowledge and human mind can only subjectively perceive matter. So that must mean we have to go and search for it. So there was also a rejection of intolerance and religious persecution. And the belief really took hold that government was a contract with the people. So much so that when you read the Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, whole paragraphs and ideas were right out of John Locke's writing of how the king had abused his power and therefore forfeited his power. This Enlightenment thinking began to even take hold in despots. Catherine the Great in 1775 abolished the serfdom. Freed serfs could not be returned to serfdom. She did it for political reasons to keep her seat, but Australia's King Joseph or Emperor Joseph II abolished the Catholic Church and confiscated church property. In other words, he separated from the Pope. He also kicked the priests off the government payroll. He opposed a single language, German, and abolished serfdom. And he began taxing aristocrats, the rich, the former privilege got taxed, not just the poor people. Now, Britain began to expand. Britain began to expand. And it grew a great colonial system under this mercantile system. The mercantile economic system drove colonialism. How do you take new wealth from France? France was powerful. As a matter of fact, France was the master at the time of mercantilism. You went instead and took it from places that you thought had no people, or the people there were very weak or backward or inferior in some way or another, justifying your ability to take things from them, or you just thought it was a plain out open land and you could take it and claim it. And where was all that? Mostly in the Americas. But the British also ran through India, the Pacific, so did France. And I think before we finish, I'll put up a picture of the empires, but we'll move on right now. And they developed these empires of colonialism. And I've got some stuff on that I'll put in the next slide or next presentation. So Great Britain formed the East India Company. And of course, that was all about tea and spices and whatnot. And it was to get them to Britain. And of course, they worked through the Maratha Empire in India and made friends with them. And that gave them great power and the British great power. And they ceded territory to Britain for protection and profits. Nice exchange. But it gave the Britain a military foothold and economic foothold to exploit things from India. Mercantilism was really based on extraction economies. Take it for the good of your people, not for the good of anywhere else. Okay. So, indeed, in terms of the revolution, there were a bunch of them going on. The Industrial Revolution, there were a bunch of them going on. But Great Britain became the leader in Industrial Revolution. Here's why. Great Britain was going through an era of economic prosperity. They had protected resources in their colonies for their use only. They established the American colonies for 150 years and extracted from them. Just lost my place. Got to come back to that. I have notes, you see. Okay. The British had developed capital. They had a central banking system. And they had allowed, through these cottage industries, more people to hold profit. So when new ventures came out, people had money to build a factory. And in 1776, part of the Enlightenment, almost in the middle of it, Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. And when he writes The Wealth of Nations, he has a laboratory, and that laboratory is the 13 American colonies, who were originally settled by what most British citizens would have considered ne'er-do-wells. Some adventurers, some for profit. Sir Walter Raleigh went for profit, lost his shirt. He's the one that founded the first colony of Roanoke that we can't find anybody that was, or where it went. That led to some of the colonizations led to the formation of companies like the Virginia Company for profit. And those companies allowed the sharing of liability. In other words, investors only lost their investment and not everything. And so they didn't become debtors. And that was unique and kind of antithetical to government control, because now these people could control their investment, their return, their profits, and how to spend them. That's kind of outside government controlling everything. And that developed in England. And that laissez-faire, that's Laissser, FAIRE economy. That means basically government hands off, led to a growth of a merchant class, first through the cottage industries and later through factories. Okay? And there was a social belief in mobility and that you could take some risk because it was possible to take a risk and be successful at that risk. The idea of experiment and control of natural laws was taking leaps and bounds in England. There was greater acceptance of the Enlightenment than in England than elsewhere. And in England, they began to develop a railway system, which we'll talk about more. Now, there were other things in Europe, however, that also contributed. Raw materials were abundant, especially with the colonies that all these guys were forming. The payoff was particularly good for Great Britain. They had really won the War of Empire when they conquered or controlled about 25% of the world's population and 20% of the world's landmass was British subjects. The Ag Revolution had occurred, the Agricultural Revolution, where we had crop improvements and animal breeding occurring, breeding for certain traits like meat, like the foods that they would be able to consume. That led to a much more abundant source of healthy food and longer lives, which increased the population. There was a decrease in disease and a decrease in infant mortality. And then add that length of time people were living. So with more kids and more population on this island, Great Britain is, after all, an island, some folks couldn't farm. So you had to have a way to provide for them. Aha, a merchant class, middle class. And with factories, we're going to study, we'll get to it, there was a development of what's called a managerial or middle class that didn't exist previously. So These are the precursors that allow the developments that are going to lead to the explosion in the Industrial Revolution. And that occurs with the explosion of water power, and then steam power, and finally electricity. And we'll take up those in the next video.